Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, I'm excited to have you here, Phil. Just another one of the professors that has come on the show here from the American College. I'm a bit of a consumer of all things American College. I might be called a bit of an addict when it comes to the American College educational programs. Tomorrow, actually, I am going to be sitting for my final CHFC exam. So I'll be able to add that along with my CLU and my CFP and my RACP. And I have yet to do the CAP program. This one is relatively new to me.
Yep. Now you're obligated.
Yeah, I feel that way. And I would love to have you as a professor. Can you just kick off the discussion here, sharing with us what CAP is and what that means to advisors, why this is such an important area of planning and education for financial advisors?
Yeah, it was established about 20 years ago by Bill and Sallie Wallace. And Bill had been in the insurance business and rose from being an insurance agent to being the head of his company and, made quite a lot of money along the way. And he and his wife, Sallie, were always very generous. They gave to a lot of causes. But what they noticed is that, as they put it, our nonprofits can bring us to tears with their needs and what they serve. But they know nothing about our money. And our advisors know everything about our money, and they're cold as ice when it comes to our philanthropy. Yeah. Right? I mean, this. This is the truth. So what they wanted was to have the nonprofit people participate more in legacy planning and estate planning. So it wasn't just about the money. It was about accomplishing something with your money beyond yourself and your family for those people who want to do that. So the purpose of the program is to bring these really different groups of people together in common purpose to better serve people like the people in your audience, to give them a better chance to get a legacy plan that reflects or a giving plan that actually reflects who they are and what they're trying to accomplish and not just the financial specifics.
Well, I think it's a complex area of financial planning, and maybe it's not. I think it seems complex to most, especially when we get into more advanced strategies. And I think much like the RACP program, it was built for a gap in financial education for advisors. There wasn't any formal education specifically around retirement income planning. I think the same thing is true with philanthropy. And first, I think we just have to distill down what philanthropy is, because I do think philanthropy is pretty broad. That the definition of philanthropy can be pretty broad. How do you define philanthropy?
Well, I think philanthropy, probably for many people in your audience, seems like a very alien term because it's associated with people who are worth, $1 billion or more. Mm-hmm. But I think what it really comes down to is if you start with where the word philanthropy comes from, it comes from a Greek word for love. Okay. And if you say, where does the word charity come from? It comes from karatos, which means love in the heart. And if you think about, your religious traditions, how essential faith, hope, and charity, in which faith, hope, and charity meaning love, and the greatest of these is charity. So when you think about philanthropy, it's not necessarily somebody else's, yacht that we're talking about. Or we're really talking about how you live your life, how you raise your family, where your roots are, what you care about, and what you want to pass on to other people, what's circulating through you. Not just money, but love. And how far does that love extend, and to whom and in what form? Who's your neighbor? Who's not your neighbor? There have been books written on that topic. So I think philanthropy or charitable giving essentially is about love. And I personally feel it's primarily about love and community. And then secondarily about tools and techniques, and also to some degree about impact, about results. It's where it's coming from in you and serving the community, but it's also about accomplishing something because you're putting something into it. You're putting your money, you're putting your time, you're putting your skills, you're putting your connections. All that goes into giving. And you'd like to see some return on that investment. If you see it as an investment, you want a return. But I think I think if you start from the idea of who do I love, what do I love, you're going to get off on a better footing.
Yeah. Well, I'll have this
techniques.
But I do think that, when you phrase it that way, when you say philanthropy is love, and then that makes it sound like it's for everyone. When we have these conversations, sometimes I'll ask someone, are you philanthropic? Are you interested in giving to charity or volunteering your time? And quite often I hear no. Yeah, I'm not philanthropic.
That's true. You do hear no, and it's terrible. It's a terrible I think mismatch or disconnect with the audience. And if I were to say to you, are you insurance inclined? What are you going to say?
Yes.
Well, you're a very unusual person. Most just say, no, I don't even know what you're talking about. It doesn't sound good. And when you raise the subject of philanthropy, people assume you're somehow about to ask them for money or guilt them into something, or you're talking about billions of dollars. But if you ask a much more human kind of question, okay, what's your first memory of giving or receiving a gift?
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn about giving, generosity, sharing from your mother?
Right.
When you look at the way your kids and grandkids are going, are you concerned about, from moment to moment, about their being too concerned just for themselves and, want to get out of their shell and give back a little bit? There's a saying I picked up from a book on raising generous kids, which I think is just really, really good. The woman was asked, the author of the book was asked, when do you first talk to children about giving?
Yeah.
Her answer was the first time they say mine. So that's a pretty young age.
Yeah.
That's like age 1 or 2, probably. So I think if you think about giving as woven into the fabric of your life and giving, defining for you a community, you think about your family, gifts at Thanksgiving, the holidays, think about your religious organization, not just the amount you're giving, but the sense of it being a participation in the community. There's the offering, right? It's an offering. And the roots of this are really, really deep in human nature. And they obviously predate money. They predate money. They predate writing. Okay. So when you lay all these other more complex tax codes and things on it, you can sometimes forget the root of this is compassion, care, and concern, and self-expression, and being who you are as a person, and finding another avenue, another venue to be yourself. And I think particularly as people, in your audience enter retirement or approach retirement, we're kind of trained to understand ourselves in the world of work. If I say, who are you? You're supposed to answer that with a job title.
Right.
Right. You're introducing me. So you look for my job title. So who is he? He's the guy with his title. But who am I outside that title? Take the title away. What's left? And I think as you approach retirement, enter retirement, you feel this kind of stripping away of your identities that were based on your title, your world of work, showing up for work. You kind of have to get back to asking, who am I? What do I stand for? What do I have to give? What do I have to give in every sense of the word? Mm-hmm. So that connects, I think, to your nonprofit life, which again connects to giving. But I think I put the giving in the context of what are you doing with your time, your money, your talent to have a meaningful impact on the people and things you care about.
Well, as you explain it, I'm seeing, I think most of us, I know, especially as a financial planner, I think of philanthropic planning as something that's very technical. It's science, right? But as you say it, it sounds more like art.
Right. It's both. It actually is both. And I think that's the beauty of it in terms of it being an interesting field to be in. There's the human side of it's what interests me primarily. The tools and techniques are a necessary thing. I mean, you've got to be able to master those in order to do justice to the client situation, the donor situation. But really it is very close to being an art in the sense that it comes from the heart. It's a craft you master. You learn by experience. And I think fundamentally, although I'm probably one of the very few people to be saying this, it is fundamentally a form of self-expression. It's how you show up in the world. Mm-hmm. the way through art you do and work, but outside of work, how do you show up in the world? And as a parent, in various roles, but one of them is your social role, your role outside the family, beyond the family, but not at work.
Yeah,
and for retirees, that gets to be an issue because you're not going to work anymore.
Right, exactly. There's so much more opportunity as you get that to that time in your life when you have that financial freedom because you have the time. And as you say this, I wanted to ask, what's the intersection of philanthropy and legacy? But it sounds much like the conversation I had with Dr. Jan Fried not long ago, where she talked about a breadcrumb legacy. It's how you're utilizing your time every single moment of every day. It's those little crumbs that you're leaving behind, not a big lump sum you're leaving at the end of your life.
Yeah, I think the term legacy changes. I think that it changes in terms of how you understand it depending on your age.
Mm.
You age into different understandings because your position on your life timeline changes. And I've been working in this field of legacy planning long enough to have aged into the demographic, you might say. And I can tell you, the way I understood it when I was 45 or 50 is completely different the way I understand it at my age now. When you're 35, 45, 50, you really, first of all, you're pretty close to being immortal. You're still saying, if I die, not when I die. And you're still thinking of all the things, all the work you have yet to accomplish. And you have kids,
Mhm.
you're really you're really looking forward to getting certain things done. And you see yourself with a 3-year plan, 5-year plan.
Yeah.
There comes a point, this is really, it's somewhat shocking to me because, I didn't expect to get old. I think it gets to be shocking when you reach the point where your 5-year plan, you may not be there. How do you plan for 5 years when you're beginning to realize, there's this life expectancy curve. And at some point, I'm planning for a life where I'm not going to be in it. Okay. Legacy becomes extremely urgent as you approach the age where you can actually visualize the end of the runway. Okay. And you say, what can I do today that's going to have effect after I may not be here?
Mhm.
That's when legacy planning suddenly gets really, it goes from being hypothetical. And I
Mhm.
totally identify with the breadcrumb trail thing. Is what you do every day that is your actual legacy, because that's how you're going to be remembered. That's the effect on other people. That's all the things you set in motion. But as you think about who am I today? What can I still do to make a difference? That timeline gets shorter and shorter. And you begin to think, how can I get this done through somebody else when I don't have subordinates anymore? I don't have a company anymore. How can I get it done through somebody else? And I think that's kind of the legacy. That's the inward side of the legacy conversation. I think so many advisors are a generation younger than people having this conversation. It's hard for advisors, I think, to identify with it. And there's kind of a disconnect because the questions we're asking as younger people are eliciting younger person's answers. And for an older person, it's going to be a different answer because they're not going to be in the picture.
Uh-huh.
Isn't it hard to imagine building something when you're not going to be in the picture?
Right.
At your age, it'd be really hard to visualize that. But so how do I create something, get it going today, and keep it going after I'm gone through people who I trust to do that work? And that's the nonprofit connection. That gets you back to the nonprofit connection. This organization made me who I am, perhaps. I identify with them. I've got their sticker on my coffee mug, the sticker on the back of the car, identify. It's on my resume. You ask me about myself, I start talking about this organization. I may have served on the board. How can I get something good going today that expresses who I am, that will continue through them? That's kind of a legacy. That is, I think, the older person's version of legacy.
Well, that begs a question on when we start thinking about philanthropy and where it fits into the financial planning process.
Well, I think it depends on your circumstances. And I think one of the healthy things that comes from advisors embracing philanthropy as a topic, if you were to study, the state of the conversation of philanthropy, it's probably one of the top 5 conversations people above a certain age want to have, or above a certain net worth. So, beyond a certain level at which people are just scrambling to pay their bills, it's one of the top 5 topics. Okay. And it's right up there with building wealth. So it's good advisors are getting involved. I think the biggest, two of the biggest things they can do is, one is to convene a better conversation about who you are and what you're trying to accomplish with your life and your money. That's very important, but not all of them have the empathy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's how to, once I'm clear on where I'd like to have an impact and how I want to be living my life, I think advisors can play a very important function in doing some essentially rather basic work. Because the thought process around legacy or giving, I think, really has kind of a classic example. There's the counterexample is tithing, where you put giving first. For some people, that's a religious obligation. They put it first rather than paying their bills. But from a typical financial planning standpoint, you start by asking, will there be enough for me? Okay. Am I going to go broke before I give my money away? Am I going to go broke? So that's your basic cash flow analysis, retirement planning. And that's CFP 101, right? That's right out of the financial planning playbook. Making sure that when you die, your net worth is still rising, or it's gently declining, but you're not going to run out of money before you run out of time, right? That's what we all do for a living in financial services. But when you look at somebody's net worth growing over time despite their spending. So you've done the retirement planning with them. You know what I'm talking about. You look at the numbers and you just can't make them go down. You reduce you increase the inflation rate. They're always going to be worth more tomorrow than they are today.
Yeah. You've got a negative required rate of return.
Yes, exactly. And there are many people are like that you don't think of as rich. Absolutely, positively, because they planned well. The stock market has been favorable and they live modestly. They live within their means, and their means grow. High school teachers, firemen, people like that are often far better off financially than their people who have more because they spend less.
Yeah.
It's not as tippy a structure. So when you see the net worth rising over time, the next question is, where do I want my stuff to go when I'm gone? So is there enough for me and my wife? Where do I want my stuff to go when I'm gone? And I think that gets you into the conversation about heirs. And advisors traditionally talk about, they talk as if more for heirs is always better. It's just how we've been trained. My job is to reduce taxes, do all these sophisticated techniques so your heirs get more. It really is much wiser to start by asking a question like, what are you up against with your kids? How are your kids doing? How are they doing with money in particular? Is there an amount beyond which wealth might hurt them? Is there an amount below which it might hurt them? What's the right amount? That's a question that's more like a dilemma than a math problem.
Yeah.
Because it's going to depend on the character of the kid. It's going to depend on the age of the kid. It's going to depend, what they did for Mother's Day, all that stuff comes into it. But you've got to determine the right legacy amount if you're going to hit the legacy amount. That's probably the toughest part of this conversation. What amount, in what form, when to the kids? And that's a math problem again. So you start with a net worth, you subtract out what you're going to need to live on for yourself. And then from that, you arrive at what could go to the kids, maybe. But is that too much or too little? If it's too little, there are ways you can build it up probably. But if it's too much, that's where you get into fairly serious legacy planning, because you then begin to think about, for example, let's say you don't have any kids. Let's say your spouse is already gone. And you're talking about nephews and nieces, or the nonprofit you're so close with, your church, your hospital, whatever organizations have touched your life. And so at that point, you really begin to think more seriously, because you realize, oh my gosh, I had not thought of myself as wealthy, but when I look at my net worth rising and so do all the subtraction, there's going to be a substantial amount of money. There's going to be enough to care about. It's not trivial anymore. It's not like $100 here, $100 there. It's going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even more than that. And that requires some care. Okay, that requires some care. You get into tax tools and techniques at that point, but you also get into thinking about what nonprofit, in what form, over what pattern of payments, for what result. You begin to think more systematically about that. And that kind of gets into the world of fundraising, but that's where these plans kind of fall into a black hole, because a fundraiser doesn't think very systematically. They're just asking for the gift. The advisor doesn't think about connecting dollars with the nonprofit. So you just end up basically with a lot of money stuck in charitable tools, usually, without those tools really having a purpose.
Yeah. I find it is really, you talk about proactive versus reactive giving in some of your talks. And I think it's just so important. And I find it so much more beneficial financially if we can have this conversation sooner and get people over the hump where they can start thinking charitably sooner rather than later. There's much better planning opportunities if we can accomplish that. But it's really difficult when we're, I think, 60 years old and we can't wrap our heads around that we actually have enough. And usually it takes 4-5 years of continually having these conversations with a client before they finally go, yeah, you're right. I don't need that money. This is never money.
Right. I'll tell you a quick story. It's at the other end of the wealth chart, but it just shows everybody has the same issues. I saw an interview on television with Ted Turner. He was a founder of, CNN, and very, multi-billionaire kind of guy. And at the time, he actually was married to Jane Fonda at one point. And he was being interviewed about a massive gift he'd given to the UN to clear landmines. It was like $1 billion he'd given to the UN. And it kind of went through his life story and his business success and his philanthropy. And at the end of the interview, the interviewer was in a restaurant with him saying, Ted, what's next for you in your philanthropy? Softball question. And he drew back like he'd been stung by a bee. And he said, Look, I'm down to my last billion.
Yeah.
So, even people who are billionaires need to be reassured that billion is, enough
Yeah.
to get through the rest of their life. And
Hmm.
the same is true of people of ordinary means. They need a financial planner to help them understand what they can afford to give.
And I find that no matter how many times you go through that financial plan, you utilize multiple softwares, heck, throw a spreadsheet, use a calculator, it just doesn't feel like enough until you get further into that experience of retirement and financial freedom.
It
And I
takes
don't know, I guess my
reassurance.
question for you is, what can we as advisors do to better help individuals move along this philanthropic planning path quickly?
Well, I do think it starts with the one thing that you're indispensable in, which is to make sure they have enough. Okay. That's the financial planner's job, is fiduciary responsibility. And then once you know they have enough because you've run the numbers up, down, and sideways, and you got the experience, have they bought into that? Do they appreciate that they have enough? Do they really understand they have enough? Have they taken to heart? Because it'd be a shame to have more than enough and still feel poor,
Yeah.
right? So once you reach that point where they're beginning to plan from abundance rather than scarcity, the heart begins to open to new possibilities. And I'd be kind of looking for that moment where their heart is opening to the other things they would like to do, and you're able to assure them that they can do. And some of those things involve people outside their family, involve people and causes and organizations outside their family, and then helping them think as systematically about that side of their life as they do about the stuff they work on with you. How much can I afford to give to what organization, in what form? Do I need money coming back the other way to me? What will be accomplished with my money?
Mhm.
What kind of reporting will I get? Can I meet the people inside the organization who are doing the work? Those kind of questions are non-traditional for advisors to ask, but they're good for clients to ask, and they wouldn't know to ask if you didn't tell them it was okay.
Phil, I'm curious, how has the idea of philanthropic giving, charitable giving, how has this idea changed throughout your career? You've spent so many years, decades even, in this field of work.
Well, I'm not sure the field has changed as much as our perception of it. I think I understand it a lot better. I was trained as a financial advisor in the traditional way, and I was trained to think of it as basically being about controlling money and tax planning and tax efficiencies and things like that, cash flow kind of issues, tax flow issues. And what I have discovered is it is really secondarily that. And I think you kind of see it even with the recent tax reform. I mean, if you ask about giving as a percentage of the gross national product, is 2%. It's been 2%. It's still 2%. It's been 2% for 20 years. It's 2% this year. It's 2% last year. And you look for changes because of tax changes, and you just don't find them. Even though for many people in your audience,
Hmm.
they're no longer getting a charitable deduction. I mean, we're obsessed with it as advisors.
Yeah.
But most of them aren't getting it anymore because they raised this so-called standard deduction to a point where that's like a threshold. It's like a deductible. You got to get over that amount or you don't get a deduction. And I bet very few people in your audience know that. And I bet very few essentially care very much. In reality, they give because they love the organization. They feel
Yeah.
some kind of obligation. And of course they give. It's like expected.
I think
But I
as
do think,
advisors, quite often we want to lead with the tax planning benefits rather than the more meaningful impact.
well, it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever seen the cartoon, the spouse comes home from the store and the clothing store, and there are, let's say, three outfits, and the justification for buying three is they were 30% off. Tax is a savings. It saves you on something, but it doesn't justify the activity in the first place. I mean, so you're going to save 30% off. Do you want to do it in the first place? And so it really isn't about the tax savings, I don't think. It's really about the satisfaction you're getting, the impact you're having, and the way you're expressing who you are and who you want to be. And I think one thing that has happened in the last few years, and maybe over the last 5 or 10 years, there's so much more wealth disparity. I mean, the wealthiest people are getting wealthy really fast, and ordinary people are kind of where they used to be, and the poor people are getting worse off. And that gets reflected in the giving. And for very obvious reasons, if you have less, you give less. So when you look at giving by people whose income is less than
Mm.
$100,000, that has been a slow, steady decline. And the giving with people whose ordinary income is a million or more, just cash flow coming in, has gone way up. So
Mm.
the overall statistic of 2% is there, But I think the sad part is the squeezing out or the reduction of ordinary people's giving, because it's not just reducing, it's not so much a cash flow issue for the charities, it's a civic participation issue. It's as if we were losing faith in the organizations we support. I hope it's not losing faith. I hope it's just we don't have the money, but still you lose something. It's like people not voting. In other words, even if you give $5, it shows you care. Remember the parable about the widow's mite?
Mhm.
You know, Jesus is in the temple, and you know, I'm fictionalizing the story slightly, but it's in the spirit of it. Let's say they're building a new wing on the temple,
Mhm.
and the richest person has given this lead gift for 30% of the thing, and everybody else is being honored. And this the poorest person in the congregation gives the equivalent of a nickel, and Jesus says her gift was the greatest because she gave all she had.
Mhm.
Okay, so when we stop giving to nonprofits, we're really depriving them of the lifeblood, not just of money, but of participation and love and support. And they're, by definition, public charities. I mean, they depend on base public support. So I think there's a movement towards the high end, which I think is somewhat unfortunate. And that's where we tend to cluster with all the stuff, all the technical tools and techniques, working with the wealthy.
Mhm.
It's just important to show up for the organizations you care about, some way, shape, or form. If you can't afford to give, show up, volunteer, serve on a board, serve on a committee.
Yeah, given that we've seen this trend, so we're still giving 2%, but the wealthy are giving more. Those below 100,000 in income, say, are giving less and less. That has to have an impact on where the funds are going, right? Are we seeing more funds, I would assume, going to politicians versus local organizations?
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting. It is not charitable giving is distinct from political giving in terms of the way the tax code and all that treats it. But from the standpoint of impact, there are people trading off philanthropy or giving versus political giving. They see it in their own mind as being related. In other words, if this cause you care about, something makes you angry, you might try to fix it through giving, or you might try and fix it through politics. And so there's a trade-off there, and there is more political giving for sure. But, I think one of the biggest reasons people aren't giving is they don't feel secure.
Mhm.
I think particularly in this year with COVID and all that, people don't feel so secure. So financial advisors being able to help them with their finances does contribute to that sense of abundance that can flow over into giving.
I find one of the gaps, let's say that we go on this road and we start to identify who we might want to leave funds to. And quite often, we'll meet with an individual that says, yeah, I know I've got more than I need, but I don't even know where to start. I don't know who I want to give it to in the first place. What would you say to them?
Another little side statistic that is maybe relevant to this. If you look at the giving trends, okay, and you say, if I were to ask you, what are the 2 or 3 most generous cities in the United States? What will come to your mind in terms of giving per capita?
Uh, Per capita, I've got to think that,
As a
it depends
percentage,
on
as a
also,
percentage of the money flowing to that community. So
right. Well, and you've got to go back to defining, well, what is philanthropy? I'm going to go,
yeah,
well, it's probably the DC and New York and
that's what I would say
Chicago.
too.
So,
That's what I would have said too. But I was actually giving a talk in Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, and it was a community foundation and advisors there. And one of the things I try and talk about in my program is it brings up the level of giving in a community. And some of the communities I work with have like CAP study groups, and they try to compete, to see who's going to do the best job as far as stimulating philanthropy in the community. So I was kind of making that appeal. And I said, someday Memphis could be the philanthropy capital of the world or the country. Somebody in the back of the room raised her hand and she said, "Are you aware that we already are?" The Chronicle of Philanthropy had done a study of the most generous per capita communities in the United States. Memphis was number 1, and number 2 was Salt Lake City, Utah. What do you make of that?
and then, well, Salt Lake did come to mind. That was on my list.
But how do you explain it?
Oh, I don't know. Especially
Tithing, the
there's
way you
a wide
explain it.
disparity between Memphis and Salt Lake demographically, right?
But Salt Lake is LDS Mormon, and they have a very strong religious obligation to give. Memphis is very Christian, and they have tithing. And that whole Christian or faith-based giving is like this undercurrent to this whole conversation. So you're asking about where to give and why and all that kind of stuff. I think you really have to get back to who you are in terms of your personal commitments. And there's a whole strand of philanthropy, which maybe I can explain it in kind of a humorous way. I've been married to my wife for, gosh, we can hardly count the number of years, like let's say 50 years. I was a kid when I met her, and we've been married. We married spiritually for the first meeting. Really, we've been together, for a long, long time. And
so you're allowed to forget your anniversaries at this point.
I actually, it's not a good idea though. You can kind of get away with it, but you better not. I've got on my electronic tickler system here. I'm not going to forget again. But if you think about what is the right way to meet the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with, think about that as a problem. A certain kind of person can say, well, how many women are there in the world? What are my criteria? What platform has the most women I can date on there? I'm going to run this algorithm against it. That's not how I met my wife. I think loyalty counts. I think fidelity counts. And I'm not in the market for shopping around for the best woman. I'm in the market for being as best husband I can be for the woman I married. And I think taking that attitude into your philanthropy is one way to approach it. What organizations have been good to you? What organizations are part of you and your family's identity? And what can you do to be a responsible member of that group and give back in accordance with your means? I think that is very much to some degree a faith-based perspective, but I also think it fits with schools, it fits with hospitals, it fits with organizations that have touched your life. And I wouldn't reject that, and I wouldn't be ashamed of it. And I think a lot of the public press is around, well, there's got to be an algorithm and somebody else in some other community. There's logic to that too. There's definitely logic to that. Okay. But before you get into this puzzlement over, what's the best possible organization, I think I would say, what organizations am I loyal, which have been good to me, and how can I give back? And until I had satisfied that part of my giving, I wouldn't get too worried about the best possible charity for the next dollar.
Yeah. I really
this is important.
I love the analogy with marriage. Had I put together criteria, I would have married myself. I never would have married my wife.
Exactly.
You fell in love, right? And if philanthropy is about love, then start with love. What do you love, right?
I think that's right. I think, these are strange words to use a lot of times, but I mean, it's love, it's obligation, it's responsibility, it's reciprocity, it's fidelity. I think the nonprofit sector keeps those values alive in ways that the investment sector and commerce just don't. And so, anyway, I'm not speaking against more systematic philanthropy, because obviously you can give to an organization and then feel disappointed that your gift wasn't used very wisely. They don't provide any stewardship. Right. You're not sure they spent the money wisely. So you can go online and do research, and you can look at what your friends are giving. But I think for most people in your audience, it's a question of giving more effectively to the organizations you already care about. Because if you think about, your normal giving patterns, I bet if I went through the where'd your money go with you or your, members of your audience, it's going to be a wildly miscellaneous list. Right? It's going to be 15, 25. If you've ever looked at the tax forms, where we used to report where they're giving, it's $10 here, $10 there, $50, $100. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's just they asked and I gave, and couldn't get them off the phone, and I felt like I owed them, and it's not very satisfying. I think the first step would be to kind of say, well, which of these gifts are best in line with what I believe in, and can I eliminate some of the static, the things where I really don't care and don't understand. I'm just giving because they asked, and narrow it down to a fewer number, where your gifts are a little bit larger, a little bit more strategic, and to begin to ask, what are they doing with the money? And are they using it effectively? And can I structure my big gift, and we're going to make a big gift in such a way that I actually do have some solid sense that a program will be conducted that I can be proud of.
Well,
something we don't think we're proud of.
The media has created some fear in giving to nonprofit organizations where you've got CEOs making tens of millions of dollars a year. So yeah, we can start with love, but there is going to be this point where we need to start vetting the organizations. And I don't know that most people have any idea where to even begin.
Well, if you want to do that kind of research, there are intermediate organizations like GuideStar. You can go to GuideStar and you can do research if you're data driven, and they will give you things like the expense ratios and all of that. But all I would say to you is, again, I'm kind of making a point a passionate point. I think that the best way to get to know an organization is to be an active participant in it. If you think about how venture capitalists give money, they serve on the board. And if you're going to start making a bigger gift, it's not all bad to start locally, to start with organizations you participate in, and to think about volunteering or think about even board service. And then you're actually, actually in the organ, you're knee deep inside the organization, you get the financial statements, and you can better assess the information. If you're dealing with something like the American Red Cross, and you look at their numbers, you don't know what they mean. So cost of funds raised, American Red Cross is, 8 cents on a dollar. Is that good or bad? Is that the right number? Their expense ratio is 12%. Is that good or bad? Would they be more effective if it was 15? You really don't know. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think if you start with this as a personal issue rather than an academic issue, you're going to get more satisfaction.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, we have to talk a little bit about strategy though. I know that's not why we give, but we do have to talk about strategy because if we are giving, there's nothing wrong with getting a tax benefit. And most of us want to maximize that tax benefit. It just allows us to give even more on the back end. And I think strategies have evolved. I want to talk about kind of some of the more basic strategies. We've utilized more donor advised fund strategies over the last couple of years than we ever have in our company's history. And then you've got the opposite end, more advanced strategies. Can you kind of share with us that spectrum of basic for everyone to advanced?
Yeah, I think all this kind of planning has to begin with understanding the client situation and understanding the goals. You really can't talk about tools without talking about goals first. So if you are looking at one of your viewers' financial situation, you're going to start by asking, will they have enough for themselves? And let's say that's a touch and go conversation. Let's say their cash flow in retirement is a touch and go situation. That when you're doing the projections, it looks like they may have enough. It looks like they might not have enough. And let's say on their balance sheet is a fairly chunky non-cash asset, something which is not easily liquidated, and it's a big capital gain, or it could be stocks and bonds. It could be a block of stock they bought a long time ago. It's got been highly appreciated. And they also have expressed a desire to really benefit, let's say their alma mater or their church or the museum or the hospital, and they really need to do that. It's on their bucket list. They need, there is a urgency behind that. They would like to leave their mark on that nonprofit. Well, there are tools that combine both getting income back and making a bequest. And so a gift annuity is one of those where you give the money to the nonprofit, you get an income back, and at your death, they can use the balance. And they can be written down to like $10,000. So if you aren't involved in an organization or offers gift annuities, that's a way to leave a legacy and get it locked in and get credit today. If you put it in your will, they're not going to give you much credit today because it's so iffy. But if you do the gift annuity, you get credit today for basically you get the income back and they get the amount at your death. On a larger scale, you can do the same thing with what's called a charitable remainder trust, where you're giving an appreciated asset into one of these two tools, the donor advised fund, the CRT or the gift annuity. You don't pay capital gain when it's sold because you don't own it. It's inside the tool. And you get back a stream of income based on the gross amount, on the face amount, the capital amount rather than the amount minus the capital gain. So you can actually enhance your income, get an income tax deduction, and set up your legacy all in one tool. But the reason that is interesting to somebody is they've got the right set of facts and the right set of goals. Yeah. They need an income. They want to be charitable. They've got an appreciated asset.
Well, one of the things I've found is quite often we're overlooking how simple it can be. And one of those areas where it can be really simplified is with community foundations locally. I think that's quite often overlooked.
Well, I think you mentioned donor advised funds and their role. Donor advised funds kind of compete with foundations. You could say it's almost like the ordinary person's version of a foundation. The advantage of that is you can give cash or appreciated assets into it, and you can give an amount that's sufficient to get an income tax deduction. Talk to your accountant, talk to your financial planner. You'll discover you probably aren't getting much of a charitable deduction anymore because the thresholds are too high. But if you take 4 or 5 or 10 years giving and you give it all in one chunk, kind of prepay your charitable giving obligations, then you do get a deduction. That can be a substantial difference in somebody's financial affairs. To just bunch the giving into 1 year, use a donor advised fund as the conduit. It allows you to think a little bit more systematically about your giving. You can bring your kids into it. Say, we've got this family foundation, call it that. And we need your advice on where to give out the grants. You mean to teach them to be a little bit more charitable. That's a huge benefit. Bring the grandkids into it. Tell them, we've got this pool of charitable dollars, and for your birthday, you can give away $100 or whatever it is. We have to do some research. You've got to make a case for it. I mean, that's a wonderful parenting tool or technique. So donor advised funds are very popular, and they're also just a great thing to have in the family as a way to help your kids and grandkids think about giving. And a foundation, obviously, is a much bigger version of that. It takes a lot more setup. You need an attorney. Probably most people in your audience wouldn't be prospects for it. But the donor advised fund, I mean, you can get one of those for like $10,000.
Yeah.
So, and it's not complicated. It's like getting a mutual fund. Basically, it's about that.
I think there's another element that is maybe even broader. Maybe it's the broadest of all. And there's a huge trend in this direction. We're seeing impact investing become more mainstream. You talk extensively about the different types of impact investing. And for someone that goes, what's impact investing? Can you share what that is and some of the different types?
Well, impact investing is kind of the intersection of investing with purpose or investing with social good in mind. And it's very much an emerging discipline. I think, the way you can probably be most helpful in terms of getting into impact investing is to be clear what you're trying to accomplish, what you're for and what you're against. Mm-hmm. And then work with a financial advisor who can take that information into their research on the investments that are right for you and come back with proposals. Impact investing started, a long, long time ago with the Quakers, who said, we don't want to invest in guns, and we don't invest in alcohol, we don't invest in tobacco. And we want to invest in funds where we screen those things out. That's where it started, SRIs. Now today, it's more commonly screening in the good ones as well as screening out the bad ones. So if you can say what things you'd like more of, like good governance of the organizations, the impact on the environment, whatever your hot button is, it's possible to find a screened fund which has been screened to have that in it, and to screen out things that are the opposite. So that's part of it. That's probably for people in your audience, the biggest part would be funds which are screened positive or screened negative for their values. And for that to be possible, you have to know what their values are. So it'll be part of the same conversation about philanthropy, only instead of just thinking about the dollars they're giving, you think about the dollars they're investing as expressing those same values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like there are different opinions on the dangers of incorporating this into a well-diversified investment strategy, where individuals will say, or we've heard some say, well, you can't just exclude a whole, you can't say, I don't want tobacco, alcohol, Disney, guns. You can't exclude all those things, or you're losing diversification benefits. Are there risks, in your opinion, on becoming
I keep expecting to find them. I go in with the same assumption you just did. But it turns out that actually a lot of the data is to the opposite. In fact, the organizations which are well run with a sense of social purpose don't get in trouble as much. They don't get sued as much. They don't have as much employee turnover. For example, take something as simple as diversity on boards. I mean, if you have an all-male, all-white board and it's serving a diverse community, how good is that board going to be at making decisions? So even if all you cared about was the financial performance of the company, you might want to have a little diversity on the board. Mm-hmm. I think the performance of socially screened, positive screens has actually been higher. It's actually been as good or higher. Now, that's not to say that there aren't trade-offs. And I think there's this idea that you can have your cake and eat it too, and there are no trade-offs. It's probably not a healthy attitude to have. Yeah. But the data so far is pretty favorable for screened investments. It's surprisingly favorable.
If we're starting down this path, I see it as, there's environmental, social, government funds. You've got mission-related investing, socially responsible investing. Is there really a difference between these three? Is there one that's outperforming more over the other? Which one's right for us?
I think an awful lot of this is branding. I think a lot of this actually is marketing and branding. Negatively screened has been around for a long time, and it appealed to a fairly progressive audience.
Right.
And if you heard about it, you could easily tell the people's politics, and people didn't share that politics, didn't want to participate. ESG is, I think, a more contemporary version of it. It's more upbeat. It's more business oriented. It's more about good governance, having a positive social impact, but it's not as politically progressive, I would say. just in terms of the attitudes and philosophies of the people involved.
Now, when we want to have this conversation, let's say we've listened to this conversation, we say, yeah, I do want to start doing more philanthropic planning, charitable planning, incorporating that into a broader financial plan. How would someone prepare to have that discussion with a financial planner? Is there something you should do on the front end before you go into that conversation?
Well, I think I would assume that the advisor does not do this for the most part. I would assume that, I guess this is kind of a personal comment, but I think every good advisor has a process, and that's what makes them a good advisor. They have fact finders, they have a discovery agreement process, they have step A, B, C, and D, and they've got it down to a science. That's true if you're an accountant, you're an attorney, you're a financial advisor. If they don't have it down to a science, you probably got the wrong person. That's the positive way to say it. The not so positive way is philanthropy is not part of the process. so you're going to have to interrupt them, and you have to interrupt them early. If philanthropy is going to be in your plan, you've got to state that right up front when they ask you things like, do you have any children, or what is your spouse's middle initial? I mean, right at that stage, you've got to make clear that I'm planning for myself, my money, my family, but also I care about these three causes.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't get that read into the record up front, it's going to be retrofitted to the end when they have decided for some tax reason you need some tool or technique. And that's not where it belongs. It belongs right up front with who are you, what do you love, and what do you care about, where do you want to have an impact? And that is a conversation advisors are learning to have, but I would say it's 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 today who would ask you that question. So you got to come in prepared to state it.
One of the things
the advisors are going to be responsive, but they're going to be taken aback by it because most clients don't do that. I think most clients are more generous than we give them credit for. But if you are a generous person and you are thinking about these things, be sure to let your advisor know.
One of the things I find that comes up quite often in those conversations is, yes, but maybe it's only one organization. They really care about their church. And they say, but I don't know how much I can leave. And I remember having a conversation not too long ago where they're saying, I want to leave everything to church, but is that going to be a burden on the church? Is it going to damage this church? Is it going to destroy it? It's much like leaving.
Those are really good questions. And there are ways. You mentioned community foundations a few minutes ago. Community foundations are a vehicle, and it's not just community foundations. Or there's your local community foundation will often have the name of your town or city in the title. And you can go to councilonfoundations.org, and they've got a community foundation locator. They're really in the business of solving problems like this. So you could set up a fund there, and you can say, here's my concern. The church is on shaky ground. They may not even survive. So I don't want to drop all my money and then they sink. I don't want this to be such a big gift that nobody else feels they have to give because I've, done all that for them. I don't know how well managed the place is. We've got a good pastor today. I'm not sure. So all these concerns, you can convey that to a community foundation, and they can set up a fund which either gives to that church or one like it. So it's basically where your intentions are put down in writing and then carried out over time with some sensitivity to the evolving facts, which is really what that person was asking for. They were saying, I'm afraid I can't really predict the future, and I don't want to make one big gift. So a community foundation could do that. But also most religious organizations have what I would call an upstream foundation. So if you're not Baptist Foundation, Catholic Foundation, Jewish Foundation, Methodist Foundation, almost every denomination has an upstream foundation. Catholic Charities. So you can inquire what foundation is supporting your church, and almost always you'll find one. So it's like a community foundation for your organization. And you can work with them to solve that problem. So you're giving to the intermediary that's going to be there, even if the church is a little bit, you love them, but they're a little shaky.
Yeah. I've just been ranting and raving about our local community foundation here in Fort Wayne, the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne. And I think it's so often overlooked. I mean, people want to build these elaborate charitable trusts and nonprofit organizations, family, partnerships. And really we're able to just go to the community foundation. They set it up for next to nothing. And you can either have the community foundation take over and guide those funds with your instruction, or you can have whatever heirs you want to continue to run that board. I mean, it can really be a board of directors that guides the funds at such a low cost.
Right. So if you are thinking about, where should I give outside of my little circle, you've got your little circle of organizations that are really high in your priorities, and you're being to think a little bit more strategically, but you're still thinking locally, the community foundation would probably be your best resource because they're actually working with so many nonprofits. They can know who's doing the best work, but they can also introduce you.
Mhm.
You can actually,
Now,
set up an introduction there.
if we're going to have our kids take over, let's say we have kids or grandkids that we want to take over the distribution and management of these funds after
Mhm,
we're gone,
mhm.
how do we best coach them prior to that period of time?
Well, I think you're touching on probably one of the most important issues, because if we kind of go back to where we started, values and legacy and love and tradition, um, parenting is hard, right? Not just for philanthropy. You pick the topic, it's hard. And I think one of the benefits of philanthropy is it's a little less controversial. A lot of things you might be contrary with your kids over certain things, but it's hard to be too upset about giving. I mean, if they're willing to give and work with you on their giving. So I think about a little kid, helping them determine, there's a technique to, let's say you have a grandkid and you're going to give them X dollars on their birthday. You can buy these little piggy banks that have 3 slots. One slot is for spend, one slot is for save, and one slot is for give. And every so often, if they see something on the news that upsets, they say, well, let's look for the helpers and let's give some of the money in your give pot here to help the helpers. It starts at that age. It really and truly starts at the same age as chores. And and another very simple thing you can do if you don't have any of these tools and techniques is what some people call a 1040 foundation. Okay. Our family is giving away X dollars, whatever those dollars are. You know the amount. Look at your records and say to the kids or grandkids, we would like you to help us give away 25%. And we'll give what you recommend if you can justify it.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you what, if you and your brother can agree on the same place, we'll give you another 25%. So you're being to teach teamwork around money and give and take. And then a year later, let's get together and see how you feel about the gift you made based on the kind of stewardship, the kind of results that were achieved. It really starts at that age. And I think it starts in that spirit. Um, as the kids get older, they can take on more responsibility. The tools will be responsive to that. The community foundation, the donor advised fund companies will let you um, turn over the grant making function to the kids, but the parenting part, it's no easy. It's still parenting.
Yeah.
It's still one opportunity at a time, and every holiday is another opportunity. But speaking as a grandparent myself, okay, I think it is really, in particular for the older people in this audience, the people your age are so busy building a career, and there's so many things you've got to do. Philanthropy, teaching your kids about giving and philanthropy, that may not be the top 10 things you think about getting up in the morning, but it's a missed opportunity when they're little kids
Mhm.
because they're so receptive to this whole conversation about, what's mine and what's sharing and keep it, give it. They're interested in that. And if the grandparents can partner with them a little bit to make a little project out of giving away a little bit of money and doing some research, I think that's a huge contribution a grandparent could make to the long term well-being of the family. That gift of time to that grandkid will pay dividends. They'll remember that the rest of their lives. They'll be a grandparent telling their grandkids about it. They will.
Yeah, it's amazing how often these jars come up. Yeah, I mean, you must be the 12th person I've
Okay.
interviewed. Yeah, we've talked about Rachel Cruz. We had this conversation with Brian Portnoy. We had this conversation with John Lanza, and
Hmm.
and we've used 3 jars with our
Hmm.
kids: spend,
Right.
save, and share jar. Not spend, save,
Mm.
and give. Everybody has a different thing, but
Right.
those 3 things I think are so So valuable. Spend, save, share, and requiring them to set some funds in there on the earlier years, and then helping them. I love your follow-up, checking in with the organization,
Yeah.
checking in and seeing what impact those dollars made. That's really good stuff. So I hope people share that with their kids, their younger ones that are raising kids. As we wrap up here, I want to ask one other philosophical question here, and that is, what does retire with purpose mean to you?
Well, the very word retire comes from the military, and it means retreat, which means you got defeated. So I think the first thing it means to me is that really we have to think about the final third of our lives as achieving a new set of victories and not just cleaning up after, we retreated from whatever the field of battle actually is. And I think it's a time in your life where you can begin to make choices that are driven less by financial need and more by purpose. You try all your life to do that, but it's really hard when you have other obligations. When you're a breadwinner, it's hard. Now that you're on your own, you've got enough money, it's up to you to decide where you want to invest yourself.
Where does meaning,
would be possible.
Speaking of meaning and purpose, where does meaning and purpose show up in your life?
Well, it shows up largely in what I'm doing. I had another career. I had a career in financial services. And, I did as much of this kind of work as I could within the confines of a business model. But I always want to do more. So for me, the meaning and purpose is what I'm doing. I mean, I'm very fortunate right now. It's my encore career. So, I'm pretty much wholly devoted to, outside of my family, to this kind of a work, because I feel like I'm having the biggest impact I can have through other people. I mean, about 2,000 people have been through my program. They all touch hundreds of people. And so for me, that's where it shows up. It's helping other people to do more, putting other people in a position where they can be more effective.
Well, Phil, I might have to be your 2001 student here.
Look forward to that
in the near future.
I really enjoyed to work with. You've got plenty of audience members who would benefit from it.
Well, I really enjoy this conversation. I enjoy this type of discussion. I think this is something that we need to be talking more about, and it's just not a topic that comes up a lot in the financial planning world, but it is so key, especially when it comes to meaning and purpose. Phil, thank you so much for your time.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to all the audience who listened. Thanks.